What is that? What do we do?
The Lost Lambs are escaping.
We need to go. I'm gonna get you.
Resident Evil 4 is one of the most beloved video games ever, taking the franchise to a whole new level by masterfully combining horror and action elements carefully laid out onto a spooky background. It's arguably the peak point of the series, although there have been some great installments since the 2005 game. A remake and remaster of Resident Evil 4 has long been awaited, and it's finally happening on the 24th of March, 2023. Resident Evil 4 2005, what the original game is all about. Resident Evil 4 is a massively popular third-person shooter survival horror video game made by Capcom that takes place 6 years after the events of Resident Evil 2 and follows the adventures of a special agent sent on a difficult mission to rescue the president's daughter from a mysterious and dangerous cult in Spain. During their journey, the player must defeat hordes of villagers and creatures that have been infected by a mind-controlling parasitic organism. The game has been especially praised for its dynamic camera setup as opposed to fixed angles seen in the previous games of the franchise. Resident Evil 4 received universal acclaim and is considered one of the best classic video games ever made. Its immersive atmosphere and well-built characters draw special attention. The visual design and gameplay elements have been lauded by fans and critics alike. Resident Evil 4 has been praised across all ports. Only the PC version has drawn criticism for not supporting mouse controls. The game won a ton of awards, especially Game of the Year, and has positively influenced the entire survival horror genre. It has sold over 12 million copies across all platforms. A VR version of the game also became quite popular, winning the VR/AR Game of the Year award on many occasions. The over-the-shoulder viewpoint introduced in this game has become the standard for third-person shooters and action games. Reflexes and precision aiming play an important role in this game. Resident Evil 4 has been cited as a particularly strong influence on games like Gears of War, GTA, Mass Effect, Batman Arkham Asylum, and countless others. The sound design of the game is a quiet and understated yet perfect element of the game, although it hasn't received as much attention as the graphical and gameplay components. A 720p upscaled HD edition was released for the Xbox 360 and PS3 in 2011 and later for Windows. A fan-made HD overhaul of the PC port was so good and became so overwhelmingly popular that it caught the attention of the maker of Resident Evil, Capcom, who instead of suing the fan, gave him its blessing. In 2016, a remaster was released for the PS4 and Xbox One, and in 2019, a remaster was released for the Nintendo Switch. A VR version of the game was released on the Oculus Quest 2 in 2016, but was heavily criticized around the world. This was primarily due to the content censorship in the game, which was criticized as puritanism. The voice acting was praised both for the Japanese and English versions of the game. A simplified version of Resident Evil 4 was later released on both iOS and Android. The main character of the game, Special Agent Leon Scott Kennedy, received a lot of praise, especially for the build-up of his character, including his traumatic childhood. The character of Ada Wong also received a lot of attention, not only for her deadly sexuality, but for her philosophy, wherein she only followed her true purpose and nothing else at the cost of anything. Overall, Resident Evil 4 was such a critical and commercial darling that Capcom finally had to concede and make a remake that is now only days away from release. Resident Evil 4 Remake, everything we know so far. From what we know so far, the remake will feature the original over-the-shoulder third-person shooter perspective, similar to the original game, while also drawing on elements from the Resident Evil 2 remake and Resident Evil 3 released in 2019 and 2020 respectively. It will be the first Resident Evil game to offer 6 optional control schemes, including that of the original game. The inventory of the original game, in the form of an attaché case, has been kept in the remake, as has the merchant, allowing the player to participate in trade and commerce. You know, he's the guy who would go, "What are you buying, stranger?" In a new edition, the player now has the option to block certain weapon attacks with specific weapon counters. Work on the remake started around 2018, and the main team consisted of members who had worked on the Resident Evil 2 remake. Capcom made a statement in 2022 that it was going to develop a Resident Evil 4 remake by modernizing the graphics and updating the controls to a modern standard. The makers of the remake found it very challenging and pressurizing because of the immense popularity of the original game. The facial features of the characters were especially worked on, with many of them being based on real people. The game was developed using the staple RE engine that has been used for many games, like Devil May Cry and Street Fighter. One of the trailers of the remake was criticized for its distracting rain effects, which Capcom claims to have fixed. In fact, even before the release of the game on the 24th of March, Capcom has released a 4 GB update, possibly indicating that it has patched a lot of the errors that users reported. The team did not want to disturb the original mechanics of the game and wanted to add on top of what was already there and good, as claimed by game director Yasuhiro Ampo. Knife combat has been enhanced from the original. Originally, the knife would only be used as a last resort. However, it can now actively be used as an offensive viable weapon, especially when the player is low on health. Knives can also be used to perform finishing attacks when enemies are on the ground. One trailer of the remake showed the main character, Leon, performing a finishing move on an enemy on the ground by slitting their throat. The team has been highly focused on striking a balance between horror and action, and has not been shy to include brutality. The game is set to be somewhat larger in length than the original. Although Resident Evil 4 is not an open-world game, there appear to be side quests of some sort. There are various customization options regarding Leon's attaché case, especially in terms of color. The grid system of the case has been praised based on its initial appearance in trailers and photos. The president's daughter, Ashley, has been revamped not only in terms of appearance, but also hugely in terms of gameplay. Ashley will follow Leon and help him in certain ways, like by unlocking doors, as has been seen in trailers. Ashley's appearance has been criticized in the original game. This has been remedied by giving her a jacket to suit the cold weather of Europe. There's also a ton of new weapons like the Bolt Thrower, which can throw explosive mines attached to silent bolts that can deliver good hits even to bosses, and can also be used as a stealth weapon. Enemies can be silently killed by using stealth elements like crouching and sneaking, using silent weapons like the Bolt Thrower, or sneaking up stealthily and using the knife. This is especially useful against a particular enemy called the Garrador, which relies on sound as opposed to sight to locate its enemies. Boss fights have also been enhanced, like the one with Leon's old mate Krauser, wherein Leon can now use his knife to go head-to-head with Krauser in close combat. Some new mechanics and gameplay elements can be gathered from trailers. These include huge distracting rain droplets, which Capcom claims to have fixed, Leon shooting at birds' nests to gather eggs, Leon fighting a parasite-infected dog, the presence of the merchant, and the introduction of a new enemy type, the hammer-wielding brute. The game takes a much more serious tone than the original, but the makers have preserved Leon's one-liners that give the player much relief in an otherwise serious situation. Differences between the original and the remake. There will be quite a few differences between the original and the remake. The important ones that we know of are as follows. The Resident Evil 3 remake was heavily criticized for cutting out certain sections of the original. The Resident Evil 4 remake does not make the same mistake, and not only includes all sections of the original game, but expands upon it by including new paths and rooms to explore. There are now side quests, although we don't know much about them in detail. All we know is that these were not included in the original game. Ashley now has a health bar, and on her death, the game is over. As stated before, she will now play a much less passive role, often helping the player by unlocking doors, among other attributes that may not have been revealed in the trailer. There are many new weapons and enemies, as seen in the trailer. This includes stealth weapons like the Bolt Throwers and enemies like the bullhead-wearing brute. Due to overwhelming public demand, there are almost no QuickTime events, or QTEs, wherein the player has to keep pressing a button on prompt. Instead, the player has to engage in combat, which makes the gameplay much more organic and fluid. The player can now move and aim, and, as mentioned before, the knife now plays a pivotal and active role instead of being a last resort. By popular demand, the remake will see the return of the Merchant, which will enable the player to purchase weapon upgrades and other supplies, as well as allow the player to access special treasures found across the game. A new form of currency has also been added to the remake in order to enable commerce. The environment is intended to be much darker and unsettling, as the player sometimes finds himself or herself confused and isolated. From what appears in the trailers, enemies will be much more aggressive and proactive. This can be seen especially in the trailer wherein the player fights Ganados. Switching weapons during combat was a huge pain in the original. Now, using the RE engine, the process is supposed to be much smoother and a fluid experience, so that the player does not lose any momentum while switching weapons during combat. Enemies will now use a variety of attacks to engage with the player, like punching, leaping, and holding. This makes the combat a much more enriching experience than the original. The intense opening sequence of the original game is much focused upon and talked about, and from the looks of the trailer, Capcom has improved upon it massively. The stealth mechanic of the the game has been improved upon as well, as can be seen in the trailer. Leon is seen crouching and ducking behind a wall, enabling him to completely avoid an encounter with Ganados. Ganados themselves have been massively improved upon, and they'll fight much more tactically than they did in the original game. Overall, these are the major differences that can be gathered from the trailers and interviews that have been released. Of course, more will be found out once the game releases. However, even just these few differences are enough for players around the world to be very excited about the upcoming release on the 23rd of March. Marvelous verdict. Resident Evil 4 is considered to be a classic, not just in the survival horror genre, but of video games as a whole. It introduced and debuted many new and exciting features at the time, like behind-the-shoulder perspective, QuickTime events, which was heavily criticized and will be largely removed in the remake, as well as new combat mechanics like targeting specific enemy body parts. It also revamped the dynamics of weapon upgrades. Its innovative and immersive gameplay led to it being one of the most memorable games of all time. Players have remembered this game since 2005 and have always wanted a remake. A remaster was indeed released in 2011, but players wanted more. They didn't just want shinier graphics and a higher resolution, they wanted updated gameplay and story as well. This overwhelming demand made financial sense to Capcom, and they finally conceded to making the remake. Thus, this is not just a story about video games, but a successful tale of how public demand for something can indeed successfully induce the parent company to make a particular product. More power to gamers. Resident Evil 4 is scheduled to be released on the 23rd of March 2023 on the PS4, PS5, Xbox X/S, and Windows, and we are very excited.